The cold was a living thing. It clawed its way through the thin cotton of her white shirt, sinking its teeth into the marrow of her bones. Each frantic breath Naomi drew was a shard of ice in her lungs. The cheerful, cacophonous noise of the shopping mall on Christmas Eve was a distant roar, a soundtrack to a life she was no longer part of. Red and green lights blurred into a sickening smear. The scent of cinnamon and pine was thick enough to choke on. Pain was a constant, a dull thrumming ache in her ribs where Dante's boot had connected, a sharp sting on her cheek that was already swelling into a plum-colored bruise. But it was the exhaustion that was truly killing her. A deep, soul-heavy weariness that made each step feel like wading through concrete. She had been running for hours. First from the apartment, grabbing nothing but the keys she'd managed to palm, then through the biting December streets, and finally into the suffocating warmth of the Grand City Mall, hoping to lose herself in the crowd. But there was no losing herself. Not really. Every face that turned her way felt like an accusation. Every laugh felt like a mockery. She was a ghost at the feast, a specter of misery haunting this palace of frantic holiday joy. Her dark blue jeans were damp from the slush outside, her thin shirt a pathetic defense against the chill that had settled deep inside her. The world began to tilt. The floor, a polished expanse of gleaming white marble, seemed to rush up to meet her. She stumbled, her ankle twisting, a small cry of pain swallowed by the din of shoppers and Christmas carols. She had to stay upright. If she fell, she would never get up again. She knew it with a terrifying certainty. She fixed her gaze on a point in the distance, a massive, glittering Christmas tree, and forced her legs to move. One foot, then the other. Her vision tunneled, the festive noise fading to a low hum. All she could see was the path ahead, and then it was blocked. Not by a crowd, by a man. He stood with two others, a silent island in the chaotic human river. Here fading consciousness registered details in stark, disjointed flashes. Shoes. Impossibly polished black leather shoes that reflected the frantic lights of the mall like dark mirrors. The razor-sharp crease of black wool trousers. The suit was a work of art, so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin, a dark carapace of power and wealth. Her knees gave out. The last dregs of her strength vanished, leaving her in a free fall. The marble floor was a promise of more pain, a final, hard punctuation to her suffering. But the impact never came. She didn't so much collapse as she folded, her body giving up right at his feet. Her cheek was pressed against the cold, smooth floor. Through her lashes, she saw his men tense, moving to clear her away, to treat her like the piece of trash she felt like. But the man in the center made a gesture. It was nothing, a flick of two fingers, almost imperceptible. Yet it stopped them cold. Absolute. The world went silent. It felt as though he had willed it so. The cacophony of the mall receded until all she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart. Then he moved. He knelt, not with the awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to it, but with a fluid, predatory grace. The fine wool of his trousers whispered as he crouched before her. A scent cut through the cloying sweetness of the mall. Cedar, smoke, and the clean, sharp smell of cold night air. It was the scent of power. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the deathly chill in hers. She fought to focus, to see the face of the man who had halted her fall. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and unyielding planes. His black hair was meticulously styled, not a single strand out of place. His eyes were the color of dark, bitter coffee, and they held no pity. They held something else. An unnerving, analytical intensity. His gaze wasn't on her face as a whole, but on the details. The split in her lip, the darkening bruise on her cheekbone, the faint, older scars that mapped the story of Dante's cruelty across her skin. One of his men leaned in, murmuring in a low voice. "Sir, we should go." The police. The man, the boss, didn't even look at him. His focus was entirely on her, this broken thing at his feet. His lips, thin and severe, parted. She expected him to dismiss her, to order her removed. Instead, he spoke a single word, his voice a low, gravelly command that vibrated through the floor and into her bones.
Mine.
The darkness she had been fighting finally claimed her. The last thing she knew was the feeling of being lifted, a strange and terrifying weightlessness, before the world dissolved completely into black. Naomi awoke to silence. Not the muffled silence of a hospital, but a deep, profound quiet that felt expensive. She was lying on a bed, the sheets not merely soft, but a slick, cool caress against her skin. Silk. Her mind, foggy and slow, latched onto that single, impossible fact. She had never felt silk sheets before. She sat up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The ache in her ribs was a dull, manageable throb. Someone had cleaned the cut on her lip and applied a soothing balm. She touched her cheek. The swelling was still there, but the stinging was gone. The room was vast and minimalist. A palette of charcoal gray, black, and cream. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking panorama of the city at night, a river of glittering lights far below. This wasn't a hospital. This was a cage, albeit a luxurious one. A set of folded clothes lay at the foot of the bed. A simple black cashmere sweater and matching trousers. A world away from her blood-speckled white shirt and damp jeans. On a bedside table, a glass of water and a small, white tablet. No phone.
No purse. No keys.
Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her calm. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet sinking into a plush gray rug. She had to get out. She walked to the door, a heavy slab of dark wood, and turned the handle.
Locked.
Of course. She paced the room, her mind racing. Who was that man?
What did he want?
The word he had spoken echoed in her head.
Mine.
It wasn't a promise of rescue. It was a declaration of ownership. She picked up the tablet. It was unlocked. The home screen was blank except for a single browser icon. She hesitated for a moment, then tapped it. The search engine was open. A test? An invitation? She typed the only thing she could think of. The name of the mall, the date, and the word disturbance. Nothing. No news reports of a girl collapsing. It was as if it had never happened. As if he had erased it. She tried a different tactic. Richest men in the city. A list of smiling, bland faces appeared. None of them were him. She refined her search, her fingers flying across the screen. Korean business leaders, more faces. She was about to give up when she saw it. A grainy photograph from a charity gala years ago. He was younger, but it was unmistakably him. The same carved features, the same unnerving stillness.
Minyoon Kong.
The name was attached to a sprawling conglomerate, Kong Industries. Real estate, global shipping, high-end tech. The official story was one of brilliant entrepreneurship, a modern empire built from the ground up. But as she dug deeper, through layers of sanitized press releases, she found the whispers. The rumors in financial blogs, the redacted court documents from a rival's lawsuit, the whispers of the organization, the words family and loyalty and debt, appeared again and again. He wasn't just a businessman. He was something else. Something far more dangerous. The door clicked open. Naomi's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. Minjoon Kong stood in the doorway. He had changed out of the suit and was now in a simple black long-sleeve shirt and dark trousers that did nothing to hide the lean, coiled power of his frame. He held a tray with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. He walked into the room, his movements deliberate and silent. He placed the tray on a small table near the window, his back to her.
Eat, he said. It was not a request.
I'm not hungry, she lied, her voice raspy. He turned slowly. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in the borrowed clothes, her defiant posture. Your body requires fuel to heal. You are malnourished and dehydrated. You will eat. Why am I here? She demanded, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. What do you want from me? He moved closer, stopping a few feet away. close enough for her to smell that scent of cedar and smoke again. It was clean, masculine, and utterly terrifying. "I want to know who did that to you." He gestured vaguely toward her face. "It's none of your business." A flicker of something cold and hard moved in his eyes. "When you collapsed in my path, you became my business. I didn't ask for your help. And I did not offer it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "I took it. There is a difference. Now, tell me his name." The image of Dante's face, contorted in rage, flashed in her mind. The fear was a Pavlovian response, ingrained and immediate. But then, a different feeling rose to meet it. A hot, bitter anger. An anger at Dante for what he'd done. And an anger at this man for his arrogance, his assumption that he could simply claim her. "No," she said, her chin held high. He was silent for a long moment, studying her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, every flicker of defiance, every tremor of fear, noted and analyzed. She expected him to get angry, to shout, to force the information from her. Instead, a strange, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his expression. It wasn't softness, but the hardness seemed to recede, replaced by a kind of detached curiosity. "Very well," he said, his voice returning to its neutral, emotionless tone. "We will do this your way. But you will remain here until I have my answer." He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him, the lock engaging with a final, definitive thud. Naomi was left alone with the soup, the silence, and the terrifying realization that she had traded one monster for another. Days bled into one another. Christmas came and went, unmarked except for the fact that the food delivered to her room was more elaborate. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She had access to books, movies, clothes that were softer and more expensive than anything she had ever touched. But the windows didn't open, and the door was always locked. She learned his routine. He would leave early in the morning, dressed in one of his immaculate, weaponized suits. He would return late at night. Sometimes, she would hear his voice, a low rumble from the main living area, speaking in Korean with his men. The words were foreign, but the tone was universal: command, authority, absolute control. One night, unable to sleep, she crept from her room. The door, for the first time, was unlocked. A test. It had to be. Her heart pounded, but she pushed it open and padded silently down the long, dark hallway. A single light was on, spilling from the open door of what looked like a study. Drawn by an impulse she didn't understand, she peered inside. Minjun was there, sitting at a massive obsidian desk, his back to her. The room was as sparse and controlled as the rest of the penthouse, except for one thing. On the corner of the desk, in a simple silver frame, was a photograph. Naomi tiptoed closer, her breath held tight in her chest. The picture was of a woman with a defiant smile and eyes that blazed with life. She was beautiful, but it was the fire in her expression that struck Naomi. It was a look she recognized. Her name was Hygiene. Naomi jumped, spinning around. Minjun hadn't moved, hadn't turned. He was watching her reflection in the darkened window before him. "She was my fiancée," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, a flat recitation of fact. "She believed my world was a game. She enjoyed the danger, the power. She thought it could not touch her." He paused. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with unspoken pain. "A rival of my father's took her. To send a message. They sent her back in pieces." Naomi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was his wound. The ghost that haunted his empire. "I was too late to save her," he said, finally turning in his chair to face Naomi. His eyes were black holes, bottomless pits of old grief and cold rage. It was a failure of intelligence, a failure of strength, a failure I will not repeat. His gaze locked on hers, and she suddenly understood. This wasn't about her. Not really. He looked at her, at the bruises and the fear, and he saw Hygiene. He saw his past failure. Her situation was a problem he could solve, a wrong he could right, a ghost he could finally put to rest. She was a project, a chance for him, to fix the unfixable. The knowledge should have made her feel used. Instead, a strange, dangerous seed of an idea began to sprout in the barren ground of her fear. If she was his project, then she had a purpose here. And purpose was a form of power. The next day, one of Minjun's men, a stoic man named Mr. Choi, brought her a tablet. "The boss has instructed me to find the man who hurt you," he said, his English formal and precise. "Your cooperation would be deficient." He swiped through a series of mugshots. Low-level thugs, dealers, enforcers. None of them were Dante. Then he stopped on one. "Is this him?" It was Dante. His face sneering at the camera, arrogant and ugly. The sight of him sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. This was her chance. She could lie. She could say she didn't know him. She could buy herself time. Maybe find a way to disappear when Minjun's attention was elsewhere. It was the smart thing to do. The safe thing to do. She looked at the picture. At the smug cruelty in his eyes. She thought of the pain, the humiliation, the person he had tried to extinguish. Then she looked at Mr. Choi, and beyond him, at the empire of quiet, lethal efficiency that Minjun commanded. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "That's him. His name is Dante." 2 nights later, Minjun came for her. He didn't say a word, just stood in her doorway, dressed in black, a silent summons. She followed him without question, down a private elevator to a garage filled with dark, gleaming cars. They drove in silence through the sleeping city, ending up at a deserted warehouse district by the port. The air smelled of salt and decay. Inside the warehouse, Dante was tied to a chair. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a sniveling, pathetic terror. His face was swollen and bloody. 2 of Minjun's men stood by, impassive. Minjun walked to stand beside her, his presence a solid wall of heat and power.
He didn't look at Dante.
He looked at her. "The debt has been called," he said, his voice low. "What happens next is your decision. Tell me what to do with him, Naomi." He said her name, not as a question but as a statement. It sounded different in his mouth. Heavier. More real. This was a test. A final, terrible test. The old Naomi, the girl who worked at a diner and dreamed of community college, would have begged for Dante's life. She would have cried. She would have pleaded for mercy, for him and for herself. But that girl was gone. Dante had killed her, and Minjun had buried her. Naomi looked at the whimpering man in the chair. She felt nothing. No fear.
No pity.
Just a vast, cold emptiness where her heart used to be.
She had a choice.
She could tell Minjun to let him go, and in the ensuing confusion, she could run.
Disappear.
Try to find some semblance of her old life. Or she could close the door. Forever. She turned her head, her gaze meeting Minjun's in the dim light of the warehouse. His expression was unreadable, but she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his dark eyes. Anticipation. "Make him disappear," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the concrete floor. "Make it so he can never hurt anyone again." A corner of Minjun's mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. It was not a pleasant sight. He gave a sharp, almost invisible nod to his men. They moved toward Dante. Naomi didn't watch. She didn't need to. She had crossed a line, a bright, terrible line she could never uncross. She had traded her tattered morality for a taste of power, and she found that it did not sicken her. It steadied her. Minjun led her out of the warehouse, his hand settling on the small of her back. The touch was not intimate. It was proprietary. A brand. As they stepped back into the cold night air, he stopped and turned her to face him. He raised a hand, his thumb gently brushing away a smudge of grime from her cheek. His touch was featherlight, almost clinical, but his eyes held hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with everything they had just done, everything she had just become. He had tested her, and she had passed in a way that seemed to unnerve them both. She was no longer just his project. She was his accomplice. The next few weeks were a strange dream. The penthouse no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary, a fortress. Naomi started eating with Minjun in the vast, sterile dining room. The meals were silent, formal affairs, yet the silence was charged. She would catch him watching her, his gaze intense and analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. She, in turn, found herself studying him. The way his long fingers held a fork, the precise, economical way he moved, the utter stillness he commanded. One afternoon, she was standing by the window, looking down at the city, when she saw a flash of light from a building across the way. A glint of sunlight on glass. She thought nothing of it. That evening, Minjun was late. When he finally arrived, his face was a mask of cold fury. Mr. Choi followed him, holding a tablet. Minjun took it and walked directly to her. Without a word, he showed her the screen. It was a picture of her, standing at the window, just as she had been that afternoon. A red circle was drawn around her head, the kind a sniper's scope would make. A rival clan, Minjun said, his voice a low growl. They think you are my weakness. Today, they learn you are my strength. Before she could process his words, the world exploded. The floor-to-ceiling window shattered inwards in a storm of glass and freezing air. The sound was deafening. Alarms blared. Men with automatic weapons were rappelling down the side of the building. Instinct took over. Naomi dropped to the floor, crawling behind a large marble sofa. But Minjun was a blur of motion. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He moved toward the danger. He grabbed her, pulling her behind him, his body a solid shield. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He moved with a terrifying grace, a lethal choreography she had only glimpsed before. A gun appeared in his hand as if by magic. He didn't waste bullets. Each shot was precise, deliberate. Two of his own men, who had been guarding the room, were already down, but more were flooding in from the hallway, returning fire. The firefight was short, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient. In less than a minute, the attackers were neutralized. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise. The room was destroyed. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Minjun was still standing in front of her, a bulwark. He turned, his eyes scanning her for injury. "Are you hurt?" "No," she breathed, her voice shaking. She looked at him, really looked at him. There was a dark, wet stain spreading on the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. "You are." He glanced at it as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It is nothing." One of the attackers was still alive, groaning on the floor. One of Minjun's men walked toward him, raising his weapon to deliver the final shot. "Wait," Naomi said. The word was out before she even thought it. All eyes in the room turned to her. She felt Minjun's gaze on her, sharp and questioning. She walked over to the wounded man, her legs feeling strangely steady. She knelt beside him, ignoring the blood pooling on the expensive rug. She looked into his eyes, saw the fear and pain there. She felt no pity. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice low and cold. The man just spat a mouthful of blood in her direction. Naomi didn't flinch. She looked up at Mr. Choi. "Give me his phone." Mr. Choi hesitated, looking to Minjun for approval. Minjun gave a curt nod. The phone was handed over. Naomi scrolled through the recent calls, her mind working with a clarity that surprised her. She recognized a number, one she had seen on a document on Minjun's desk weeks ago. It belonged to a man who ran his shipping operations at the port. A trusted lieutenant. A traitor. She stood up and walked back to Minjun. "It was Lee," she said simply. The call came from his personal number 5 minutes before the attack. Minjun's expression didn't change, but a new level of coldness entered his eyes. He had been betrayed from within, and she was the one who had exposed it. Later, after the bodies had been removed and a cleaning crew had begun erasing all evidence of the violence, she found him in his bathroom, tending to his arm. The bullet had only grazed him, but it was deep. He was clumsy with the disinfectant, his movements stiff. "Let me," she said, taking the cotton ball and antiseptic from his hand. He didn't protest. He sat on the edge of the marble tub and allowed her to clean the wound. Her hands were surprisingly steady. The proximity was dizzying. She could feel the heat of his skin, see the cords of muscle in his uninjured arm. The scent of cedar and smoke was mixed now with the metallic tang of his blood. "Why did you keep me?" she asked into the silence, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to understand. He was still for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her hands as she worked. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rasp. "Because when I saw you on that floor, you had the eyes of a fighter who had lost the will to stand." He lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the intensity there stole her breath. "I wanted to see you stand again." It wasn't a confession of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession of recognition. He saw the same darkness, the same will to survive, in her that he possessed himself. A week later, the rival boss, enraged by the failed attack and the execution of his mole, Lee, made his next move. A package arrived for Naomi. Inside was a single, wilted flower and a photograph. It was a picture of a small, rundown house in a state she hadn't visited in years. The house where her grandmother lived, the only family she had left. The message was clear. The enemy was no longer targeting Minjun's empire. They were targeting her world. The final meeting was set for a neutral location, an abandoned church on the outskirts of the city. The rival boss, a man named Tanaka, had demanded Naomi's presence. A sign of good faith, he'd said. A trophy to be displayed. Minjun had refused, his fury a cold, tightly controlled thing. "No," Naomi had said, her voice cutting through his anger. "We will go, and I will be there." He had turned to her, his face thunderous. "I will not use you as a bargaining chip." "You're not," she'd replied, her gaze unwavering. "I am using myself. This ends tonight. On my terms." Now, standing in the cold, cavernous nave of the church, she felt a strange sense of calm. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress, the silk a soft armor against her skin. Minjun stood beside her, a dark, silent statue of lethal potential. His men were positioned discreetly throughout the shadows. Tanaka arrived with his own soldiers, a swaggering, overconfident man who thrived on intimidation. His eyes landed on Naomi, a possessive, leering look that made her skin crawl. "Kong," Tanaka began, his voice echoing in the empty church. "You bring me the girl. A wise decision. Perhaps you are not the fool your father was." Minjun remained silent, his stillness more threatening than any outburst. Naomi stepped forward. All eyes fell on her. Minjun's hand twitched, a motion to pull her back, but he restrained himself. He was trusting her. "Mr. Tanaka," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the acoustic space. "You wanted me here, so here I am. But I think there has been a misunderstanding. You think I am his weakness. You think I am a prize." She took another step, closing the distance. Tanaka watched her, a smirk playing on his lips. "You're wrong," she continued. "I am his queen. And when you threaten my family, you threaten his kingdom." Tanaka laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your family? That old woman in the dirt-poor country? I have a man outside her house right now." "I know," Naomi said calmly. "And he's about to receive a call telling him to leave. Because you're going to receive a call from your banker telling you that all of your liquid assets have just been frozen. And then the police commissioner is going to call, informing you that an anonymous tip has led to raids on every one of your warehouses, your brothels, and your drug labs." Tanaka's smirk faltered. "What is this? What trick?" "It's not a trick," Naomi interrupted, her voice dropping, becoming as hard as steel. "It's a consequence. The man you sent to kill me? He was very talkative before he died. He gave us everything. Your accounts, your contacts, your supply routes. I spent the last 3 days with Mr. Kang's lawyers, drafting a lovely little package for the federal authorities. It's set to be delivered in 1 hour. Unless, of course, you concede." The color drained from Tanaka's face. He looked from her to Minjun, who hadn't moved a muscle, his expression unreadable. Tanaka had walked into a checkmate. Enraged and humiliated, he did the one thing a man like him always does when his power is stripped away. He lunged, not at Minjun, but at her. He never reached her. Minjun moved like lightning, a blur of black cloth and brutal precision. He intercepted Tanaka, his body a living weapon. The fight was not a fight. It was an execution. It was swift, violent, and absolute. But the final move was Naomi's. As Minjun dealt with a physical threat, she took out a small, burner phone and made a single call. "It's done," she said. "Release the information on his lieutenants. Leave Tanaka's personal accounts for us." She was not just dismantling an enemy. She was absorbing his assets. She had learned his language. In the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the silent, awestruck soldiers of two clans, Minjun walked back to her. There was blood on his knuckles. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw no analysis, no calculation in his eyes. She saw something that looked dangerously like awe. "My empire," he said, his voice a low rumble that was for her alone, "has a queen." It was not a proposal. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact. Her coronation, held in a ruined church, witnessed by killers. The cost was her old life. It was ash. Her grandmother was safe, moved to a private, guarded estate, but she was now part of his world, under his protection and his control. Naomi had traded her small, broken life for a vast, dangerous kingdom. She had exchanged one cage for another, but this one was gilded, and she held one of the keys. Months later, she stood on the balcony of the penthouse. The city glittered below, a sprawling board game of lights and shadows. She was no longer the girl in the thin white shirt. She wore a bespoke gown of emerald silk that felt like armor, a gift from him. He came to stand behind her, his presence a familiar weight at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his gaze on her, on the city, on their shared territory. He didn't say he loved her. He would never be that man. Instead, he said, "The West District is secure." Naomi didn't turn. She kept her eyes on the horizon, on the endless possibilities of the night. "And the port?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, and utterly certain. The city was their chessboard. She had made her choice long ago in a cold, dark warehouse. She was not his prisoner. She was not his project. She was his partner. And in this world of beautiful, lethal things, she was finally, terrifyingly, free.